Now, we're going to move on to On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. So, we all know the story by now. A matter of days after being detected in South Africa, new cases of this potentially more contagious Omicron variant of COVID-19 now being reported in more and more countries. The latest count around 23, and just a new case found in the United States as well, that happening in California. While there is still a lot of research that needs to be done, there are concerns the new variant could be more resistant to the vaccines currently available to us. For now, at least, this strain, unfortunately for the great many of us, has poured cold water on our hopes that the pandemic and associated antivirus restrictions would be winding down, as they kind of had been doing.
Many nations have imposed travel restrictions on flights from southern Africa or shut their borders altogether as they try to buy time before we know more information about Omicron. For more, we are joined by Ben Cowling, Chair Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Hong Kong. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Now, the WHO has deemed this strain a variant of concern. And with the data that's currently available, what do we know about Omicron in terms of its transmissibility, reinfection potential, and antibody resistance, and its susceptibility to vaccines?
The characteristics of the virus itself have already been quite widely reported. It has a lot of additional mutations on the head of the spike protein of the virus, which is going to allow the virus to infect people that might have had immunity against other strains of COVID, for example, immunity against the original virus or the Delta variant. Whether that's immunity has come from being vaccinated or being infected, the Omicron variant looks like it's going to be able to evade that immunity to some extent. But people who've been vaccinated or people who've previously been infected should still have some degree of immunity against severe disease, meaning that at the population level, the Omicron variant may not cause a lot of severe disease, but it probably will cause infections if it's allowed to spread. But we're still waiting for more information on exactly how transmissible it is compared to, say, the Delta variant, and exactly how serious the infections might be compared to the Delta variant. And I think we can't say too much about that right now.
Right, well, we don't know very much at this current time, but many studies have shown that over time, generally speaking, even the most dangerous of pathogens mutate so much, as we're seeing with COVID-19 now, that eventually they just become weaker and weaker and weaker until they're nothing more really than a common virus. Now, lots of people are hanging their hopes on that being the case here. However, how likely do you think it might go the other way, that COVID-19 could become more transmissible and more deadly?
Well, viruses could go in either direction, and I'm not sure it's the case that viruses will always tend to become more mild. But what I think we can say, and what I think will happen with COVID, is that as time goes on, as more and more people get vaccinated, get infected, in some cases more than once, infections will tend to become milder and milder. We know that infection in a vaccinated person is milder than infection in an unvaccinated person. We also know that a reinfection in someone who previously got infected already some time ago, a reinfection is milder than the first time infection. And what I would expect is, as time goes on, COVID infections become generally milder. And so we might think the virus is weakening, but actually it's about the same. It's actually our immune systems which have got better. It's the population immunity which has got stronger against the virus. And so the infections tend to resemble milder illnesses on average, rather than what they used to be. And so I can imagine a scenario, for example, in 10 years' time, in Korea, or where I am in Hong Kong, we have COVID in the community, and it tends to be like a common cold infection. It doesn't tend to cause very much severe disease anymore. But then the virus gets in, the same exact virus gets into a community in the Amazon jungle where they haven't had it before because they're so isolated, and it causes a lot of severe disease. It's the same virus, but in places that have the experience with it, immunity from vaccines, or less desirably from infections repeatedly. In those scenarios, with that exposure, then the virus would tend to have to be able to cause weaker illnesses on average.
And Professor, the Delta variant has been the most common strain of COVID-19 in recent months. It might be the case that Omicron takes its place. When this occurs, what happens to previous variants? For instance, we rarely hear people contracting the original Alpha strain anymore.
Yeah, so in South Africa, they had a large epidemic of the Delta variant a few months ago, which was already coming to an end by the end of October. And it looks like in South Africa, they'd reached herd immunity against the Delta variant. So there was very little Delta variant circulating. Now they're having this increase in numbers of cases with the Omicron variant. And so in South Africa, it looks like Omicron's going to replace Delta very soon as the most common variant being identified. In other parts of the world where Delta is still causing a lot of infections, we'll have to see whether Omicron is able to successfully compete and even displace Delta as the most common variant. There's a lot of issues at play there depending on transmissibility and the potential to evade immunity. But ultimately, the virus will keep moving. And so in some years' time, we'll have other variants that come in and the earlier variants will disappear. As you mentioned, alphas disappeared, betas disappeared, gammas disappeared, largely speaking, and eventually Delta will disappear. Eventually, Omicron will disappear, and we'll have future variants taking their place.
So while we await more information about Omicron, many governments have thrown caution to the wind, and some, I believe it's still the case for Israel, but we have reported that it's certainly the case for Japan, have locked down their borders. In Japan's case, even for Japanese people outside Japan wanting to return home. I wanted to ask you whether these border closures actually work to keep these strains out. And secondly, if you were to be asked by a national government for your advice, what would you suggest they do at this time?
I think we have to be very cautious about border closures because, for example, in Japan, if the infection has already reached into the community and is slowly spreading, maybe hasn't been recognized yet in different parts of the country, then closing the borders really won't actually have much effect on the ultimate numbers of cases of Omicron, say in 1 month's time or 2 months' time or 3 months' time, because the seeding has already begun. There's already most likely infections in the community. Now, if we could go back in time and close the borders of a country before there was any seeding whatsoever and completely close them, then that will buy time. But that's a very drastic measure, and it has a lot of other implications. Many people do want to travel. Many people need to travel. And so that's why the World Health Organization are really discouraging those kind of measures. And I think what we've seen in other parts of the world, which is less drastic, is maybe targeting certain countries to say that maybe travelers from South Africa have to do quarantine, but travelers from elsewhere maybe don't need to. And that's really a very limited measure, a measure of very limited value, because we know that Omicron is being found in other parts of the world fairly soon. The Omicron could come through a third country. So even if it doesn't get into your country from South Africa, it could come in via Europe or via the United States. And then ultimately you have to think about having the restrictions for all inbound travelers. And then when we think ahead to what's the situation going to be like in 2 months' time or 3 months' time, the travel restrictions that are put in place now are not going to make all that much difference. So they could buy you a week or 2 weeks to learn more information and to have a better plan. But ultimately, there's not that much that we can do to stop the global spread, unless, like where I am in Hong Kong and in China, we're planning to have long-term measures to keep any kind of virus out of the community. But these measures are also, of course, very costly and disruptive.
And Professor Cowling, with the spread of Omicron, will all eyes are now on like pharmaceutical companies on when will they ever be able to develop treatments or vaccines that could cure Omicron? Do you have any idea on this?
Yeah, so it's early days, but it's most likely that the antiviral drugs, there was news recently from I think Merck and Pfizer have antiviral drugs. Most likely those will still work against the Omicron variant, but we'll have to wait. Time will tell. But there's no reason that they wouldn't. On the other hand, with vaccines, I think for the mRNA vaccines, those are the ones that could be updated the quickest, and it would take 3 to 4 months until updated versions of those vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, are available. And I don't know if we'll have them in Asia as quickly as maybe the United States or Europe will have those updated vaccines. So one of the possible strategies for some countries would be to try and slow Omicron down as much as possible to buy time until those vaccines are available and then use them as booster doses. But I don't know when, for example, millions of booster doses of Omicron Pfizer or Omicron Moderna vaccine would be available somewhere like Korea, and it could be 6 months or longer, I suppose. So I think.
Hello.
Sorry.
Can you hear us?
So yeah, I can hear you. Sorry, there was something in my ear. Sorry. So sorry, lost my train of thought. So I think it's probably too long, and most likely we're going to have to rely on booster doses, third doses of the current vaccines to be available in order to combat at least the early spread of the Omicron variant. Sorry.
No problem at all. So I was reading reports this morning. I know we don't know for sure, but as far as I know, looking at the reporting that's out there, I believe no one has actually died of the Omicron variant. Is that correct?
It's still early days. So if you remember in the past, when we're tracking the progress of epidemics, we know there's delays, and we tend to see rises in cases first, and then maybe 2 weeks later, we start to see rises in hospitalizations. And then a week after that, we start to see rises in deaths. And in South Africa, we have to be particularly cautious about interpreting the situation there, because they've had 3 large epidemics in the last 2 years. First with the original virus, and then with the beta variant in South Africa, and then most recently with the Delta variant. And most people in South Africa have actually been infected, in some cases, more than once. And so when there's a high level of population immunity in a place like South Africa, even if the Omicron variant seems like it's causing mild infections there, it could just be because of that historical immunity that's been built up over multiple waves of infection, with most people getting natural infections, in some cases more than once, and a relatively low vaccine coverage. And so that the severity may be different in other parts of the world where there's not such a high level of particularly natural immunity from natural infections.
And Professor, I must ask, like in the early days of this spread of this Omicron variant, it seems like the spread was evident especially in Europe. Do we have any specific reason for this?
I don't think so. I think we need to look at the travel links between different places, and also the capacity for surveillance. So I'm a little bit surprised that in the United States they've only reported 1 case, because here in Hong Kong we've already detected 2 cases of the Omicron variant, and we don't have an awful lot of people coming into Hong Kong. We only have about 500 people arriving every day, and not very many from South Africa or the southern parts of Africa. So if we've seen 2, I imagine there's been a lot of people traveling to Europe and the United States and other parts of the world from that area of the world with the Omicron variant. And so for there only to be 1 detected case in the US, I wonder if fairly soon they'll start to pick up more cases and realize that maybe there were more than they'd known about.
And you're in Hong Kong, and so very densely populated place, of course. How is Hong Kong dealing with this situation?
So we've been blacklisted by Switzerland and a number of other countries because we have detected Omicron cases. But in Hong Kong, we still have our very strict zero COVID approach. So we don't have any cases in our community as far as we know. We're picking up a lot of cases at the border because everyone who comes into Hong Kong needs to do a quarantine in a hotel for maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and they're tested, and we pick up cases every day, including cases of the Omicron variant. So we don't have any cases as far as we know in the city of Hong Kong. So you're right, it's very densely populated, and if or when the virus does get into the community, it's going to be able to spread pretty easily, and it has done in the past. But for now, things are calm, things are quiet, and we're just continuing with this measure of the zero COVID approach, The same as in mainland China. In Hong Kong, we have hopes that we can establish a travel bubble with the mainland so we can travel without quarantine into China, and people from mainland China can come across the border into Hong Kong without quarantine. And then we'll stay here in our bubble without any COVID in the community until something maybe changes in the future, which we're not sure about. So the question that I and many others have is what's our exit strategy? Because although it's really a big advantage for public health not to have COVID in the community, at the same time, the travel measures and the potential disruption of outbreak control measures, that they're still there. And there's no sign of when those might come to an end.
Well, this latest news of the Omicron variant has, surprised many of us in the world. How has this influenced the market? How has the market reacted, like local markets and global markets? I believe it had a big impact on them.
Yes, I'm not an economist. I'm an expert in public health, but certainly we've seen a lot of concern because I think we were just hoping to see the light at the end of the tunnel with this pandemic, to say that there are going to be more cases, there are going to be more infections, but the worst is over. But now with the Omicron variant, we can imagine maybe there are going to be additional further waves of infections, even in places that feel like the pandemic's been over, like South Africa, where they've had these major epidemic waves already. And some parts of Europe were having their exit waves with Delta, and now we're most likely going to have more infections with the Omicron variant. And then there's the other part of this is, of course, the travel measures, the travel restrictions, where airlines were ramping up again, going back to pre-COVID normals in some parts of the world. And again, there's now restrictions in place and reductions in travel. And so it's just it's a bump at the end of this bumpy road of the pandemic. And I suppose there could be more bumps in the future as well, but we'll have to see.
Right. Well, I suppose there's a lot of people questioning whether the market reaction to this news was really justified, because there was a massive panic when people didn't really know what was going on. But I wanted to touch a little bit upon the effect of the politicization of this pandemic. In countries like America, it's very polarized. You have your Republicans who pile a lot of the blame on Anthony Fauci and say more people have died of COVID under President Biden than died under Trump, and that's even when they have vaccines and better treatments now. Do you think this hyper-politicization of a health issue is really detrimental to how we tackle this pandemic?
I think it really doesn't help, and it's happening from both sides of the political spectrum, of course, because if you remember back 18 months ago, President Trump ordered a travel ban on China, which we knew at the time wouldn't really make much difference. And then candidate Biden said it was racist and should never be done. And then right now, of course, President Biden has done the travel ban on the southern part of Africa. And it's the Republicans who will brand it as racist and say it's not going to help. And I think there's a lot of measures taken by governments, not only in America, but in other parts of the world, that are maybe efforts taken in what the leaders think are the kind of the best interests of the country. And a lot of people aren't happy with those decisions. With COVID, I think people are getting tired of the public health measures, whether it's travel restrictions or wearing face masks or doing the social distancing. And I think we had the hope that it was going to be coming to an end. But with the Omicron variant, unfortunately, we're going to have to stick in there a little bit longer. We're going to have to persist a little bit longer because I think we are going to see more and more infections with this variant in the coming months. But fingers crossed, though, on average, they're going to be milder. And so there won't be as much pressure on hospitals as there has been in epidemics earlier in the pandemic. And then again, hopefully we'll have these antiviral drugs becoming available all around the world. I'm still waiting to hear when exactly supplies are going to be widely available. And we also talked about the vaccines, the updated vaccines that could be coming in 3 or 4 months. And if we could have booster shots with those, I think that could make a massive difference.
And lastly, before we let you go, Professor Cowling, before this introduction of Omicron variant. South Korea has been shifting into the living with COVID-19 scheme, and we were kind of gradually returning to our normal lives. But with Omicron, and it seems like the introduction of new variants could be inevitable, does this mean that the pandemic will stay with us, for a longer period of time?
Back to square one.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think it's back to square one. I think we'll have to wait and see how the Omicron variant really plays out, because it may well be that infections are milder in people who've been vaccinated and people who've already been infected. And one thing I would say is I don't think it's possible for somewhere like Korea to go back to the old strategy of trying to minimize the number of infections, because if you go that way, you then still have to think about when you're going to exit that, when you're going to come out of it, when you're going to start again with the living with the virus strategy. But what's going to be important now and in the next maybe 3-4 months over the winter is just managing the caseload. So there's going to be cases in the community. I would say case numbers are likely going to be going up for a while. And what's important is to make sure there's not too many severe cases, not too many hospitalizations, because if hospitals run out of capacity, that's when it is really getting serious, really getting bad. But having a lot of mild cases in the community, maybe there's not enough justification at that point to have a lot of control measures, because we don't do that for flu. We don't do that for other common and mild infections. We do it for COVID because of the fear of what's going to happen with the hospitals and the healthcare system if there's too many severe cases. And with high vaccination coverage in Korea, hopefully that's going to be mitigated.
Well, it hasn't really been mitigated so far. I think ICU beds are at record capacity, and the strain on the health system is something a lot of doctors and nurses are extremely concerned about here in South Korea, but we can only hope for the best. But who knows when we're ever going to see any light at the end of the tunnel, unfortunately. Professor Cowling, thank you ever so much for spending a little bit extra time with us this morning. We really appreciate it. As always, pleasure to hear your insights, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.